Hi, my name is Justin Davidson, and I'm Jeff Davidson's son. So I'm talking about his and a little bit my experience in the dubbing world. I live in New York. I am a writer and a journalist, a critic of architecture and classical music. But early in my career, when I was in my 20s, I spent about 5 years working with and for my father, doing dubbing of American movies in Europe. And of course, had many conversations with him after that. Jeff, my father, got into the business somewhat accidentally. He grew up in New York. His father owned a clothing store, several small clothing stores. His mother didn't work, and he was very well educated. He lived on the east side of Manhattan. He went to Swarthmore College, and he really had a knack for foreign languages. The only one I believe he studied in school was German, but he picked up French. He spent a year as a college student in Aix-en-Provence, so he spoke French there. Then later on, when he was spending time in Italy, he picked up Italian. So he was very comfortable working in multiple languages, and importantly, I think, switching back and forth between them with some frequency, because that really turned out to be the core of his work. He picked up a bit of some other languages too. At one point, he knew he wanted to spend some time in Yugoslavia, and he taught himself some Serbian. I know he had a collection of Serbian comic books. But then when he wound up going to Yugoslavia, the places that he spent time were in Slovenia and Croatia. So his Serbian really didn't serve him very well, because that's not what they speak in those places. But he wasn't aware of that before he left. After college, he was a school teacher. He became a school administrator, college counselor. But he really had this idea of himself. Early on, he really thought his career was going to be in the theater. He did a lot of student productions. And then he really wanted to be a writer, which he did periodically. At a certain point, after he left the school, he was writing articles for the Reader's Digest and supporting himself as a writer of magazine articles. But along that time, when he was sort of struggling, I think, a bit financially, but also to find his way, where he was at this point, I guess, in his late 30s. So we're talking about the mid to late 1970s. So when I was a child, he met somebody through a tennis partner. He was invited to a party, and he was talking about his experiences with languages and with writing. And it turned out that the guy that he was talking to was I believe that his name was Paco Rodriguez, and he was the head of 20th Century Fox distribution in Europe. And he had a problem. And the problem was that he was distributing a movie that needed to be dubbed into Italian and into other languages, I guess, called The Wedding. It was directed by Robert Altman. And there was a scene in which two Italian actors who were in the movie immigrants to the U.S., played by the famous Italian actor Vittorio Gassman and the actor and comedian Gigi Proietti. And they played brothers. And at this wedding, where Gassman plays the father, Gigi Proietti, the brother, arrives, and he gets into an argument. And the two have this vicious, explosive, screaming match in the middle of this wedding, and it's all in Italian. And of course, nobody in watching the movie can really understand what's going on, and nobody in the wedding party can understand. But it's a very funny and intense scene. So the problem was how you dub that into Italian, where, first of all, those are known quantities. Everybody knows what they sound like, but also you don't have the language barrier that you had in the original. You have Italian speaking Italian. So the whole idea of this argument happening that nobody can understand is completely vitiated. And so the question was, like, how do you do this? What do you do? How do you keep that intensity? How do you keep the comedy? And I guess this guy Rodriguez was talking to Jeff about this, and he batted around some ideas, and pretty soon he asked him to read a script or to come in and consult. And that one thing led to another.
Luigi! You son of a bitch. Eh? Che sei venuto a fare qua? Straio! Che sei venuto a fare qua?
Ma che mi menate tutti, mi menate sto paese? Io sono venuto qui a farlo pure e mi menate!
E questo non è che il principio, io t'ammazzo!
lui!
Ammazzo! Luigi, aspetta, non fare così, l'ho appena rappezzato. Jesus Christ, io me ne frego, l'ammazzo!
Come te lo permetti di venire qua dentro, brutto, impunito, deficiente?
Oh, io sono tuo fratello, sai.
Un fratello deve rimanere lontano! Ma tuo figlio gli ha dato il nome mio, io l'ho visto sull'annuncio matrimoniale, lo sono pure conservato! Mi sono indebitato, mi sono comprato sto vestito, la cravatta, ho comprato il biglietto dell'aeroplano, ho viaggiato 12 ore sull'aeroplano, ma vedi qui non so manco che ore!
But actually, as it happened, maybe even before that, as a child, when I was going to school in Rome, I actually started doing some dubbing, got into the dubbing business before he did. I was an okay child actor, and I could learn, although it's very difficult for kids to do, I could learn to follow sync, to memorize lines, be in a dubbing studio, and sync what I was saying to an original, which is in a different language. So I did some small parts. There was a fair amount of English language dubbing going on in Rome at the time, and I was dubbing into English. I remember there was one movie in which I played the child Bruce Lee's childhood friend. So, I had a few lines here and there, but it was regular enough that I knew my way around a dubbing studio, and I met some people, and I guess my father met some of those people through that experience too. I can't say I have very clear memories of that, except sort of the experience of being in the studio. I remember there was a director by the name of Nick Alexander who was very patient with me because there was one particular time that, I don't know, maybe the sync was difficult and I was having trouble getting it, and we had to do a lot of takes. And I can imagine that can be very frustrating for a dubbing director to have a child who requires a lot more supervision. And mostly those dubbing sessions are so tightly scheduled that I'm sure I was throwing off his planning, and that must have been difficult. But he was very patient with me. The other thing I remember after my dad had first gotten involved, and I'm not sure exactly how this came about, but when Star Wars, which was the first Star Wars, later became known as Episode 4, A New Hope, but really was just known as Star Wars. Back when it came out, I guess in 1977, and I was a 10 or 11-year-old kid. And of course, I was completely mesmerized by this movie. I thought it was the most amazing thing. And my father was working on it, and he invited me to come and sit in on the mix. The reason he did was because he thought I would there was a young guy, a sound designer, who was starting out in his career. His name was Ben Burt, and he was the sound designer for Star Wars. He later became a very distinguished figure in the movie industry, won an Oscar, and of course is legendary for his work on Star Wars. But at the time, he was just a young guy, he's probably in his 30s, trying to figure out how to make these weird sounds. And I remember him telling me about getting the laser sounds of the sound of the laser gun by going to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco with a bag full of hammers and beating on the cables to get the right kind of buzz and vibration. And the police showed up and asked him what he was doing. He must have seemed like a terrorist, although it wasn't something that people were necessarily as alert to at that time. And he explained, no, he was just trying to record some sounds from a movie. And he told me about that, which I thought was fascinating, and getting exactly the right laser buzz. There's a moment where a stormtrooper falls off a high ledge into a kind of a well, I guess, and there's a scream as he goes down. And he told me that this was a scream from a library that he had found, in which somebody, I sort of remember he mentioned Gary Cooper, but I don't know if that's accurate. An actor from the 50s or 60s being eaten by an alligator. Again, I this is a child's memory. I can't vouch for their accuracy, but I remember him telling me, and the whole idea to me of remembering that you had heard a scream in a movie, being so struck by it that you wanted to find it, reproduce it, and then doing the work to go research it and find out where it was. That was magic to me. And the other thing I remember him talking about was at a certain point, Darth Vader picks up another officer, I think, from the Death Star by the neck, holds him against the wall, and then crushes his windpipe with his hands. And you hear the awful sound of his windpipe going crunch. And he told me that that was him cracking walnuts in his own hands. So those were things about the sound, and then sitting in on the mix patiently, an 11-year-old kid sitting in on this process that of getting the dialogue embedded into the music and the sound effects and hearing that over and over and over again. That was, I'd say, a very formative experience for me. I went on to be a musician, to be a composer, and then to be a writer, and all that experience, I think, has continued to serve me very well. And I have my dad to thank for just bringing me along. He wanted me to be interested in the most interesting aspects of those sessions. He was doing a lot of different kinds of things in the dubbing business at this point, working on individual pictures. So I think that was an exciting time for him because he was learning the business, because each movie was different, and because he was really going in depth to the issues that specific movies presented. And of course, the reason that they would hire him to address these issues was because the movies were particularly complex. So there really wasn't anybody else, hardly anybody, doing this work. And I think it's important to remember that as an American who spoke a lot of those languages and was comfortable in each of those countries where dubbing occurred, namely Italy, France, Spain, and Germany, and also the countries where subtitles happened. Later on, he was also involved in Latin America and Brazil, once or twice in Japan. But the core of his work was in those four countries: Italy, France, Spain, and Germany. And as somebody who was comfortable in them but was American and understood sort of the American origins, he had a unique perspective, which was really his strength. And that was the ability to interpret the original with authority. Because the way it worked otherwise is that, if he was not working on a film, was that the materials, the script, the continuity, the music and effects track, the subtitle list, would simply arrive in each country and be turned over to the people who worked there. So an Italian translator would have the script translated into Italian. Either that person or somebody else would adapt it for the sync. And then the script would arrive along with the movie, cut up into little loops in the dubbing studio, and the dubbing director was there to interpret what he saw, what he or she, but mostly he saw on the screen. And the actors would show up and they would have a 30-second loop to dub, and they had no idea what was going on. So everybody was working with very partial information. What Jeff could do was to arrive with a sense of understanding of the whole movie, but also a deep understanding of the original, and an understanding eventually that he built up of how those things could be translated. His goal throughout his career, I think, was to be faithful to the movie, but the way I think he framed it in his mind was to be faithful to the experience of watching the movie. And sometimes that faithfulness of experience diverged from the strict faithfulness that, say, the director might have imagined or might expect. And what he was able to do was to take a problem that seemed insoluble and solve it, not just for one country, but for multiple countries. And sometimes it was the same solution, and sometimes those were different solutions. I think it's best if I give you some examples from when I started to work, because they're the ones that I remember, but I think they're representative of the kinds of issues that he faced. When I started working in the late 1980s, for example, one of the movies that I was working on was called Mississippi Burning. Mississippi Burning was the story of a couple of FBI agents from the Midwest, probably, who arrive in Mississippi during the height of the civil rights movement and the violence that occurred there. And they're trying to understand but solve a murder case in the middle of all of this racial tension. So that's a case where you have the black cast, and they had a particular way of talking, that is Southern black dialect. You had the white Southern cast, and they had a different way of talking with Southern accents specific to Mississippi and particular ways of expressing themselves. And then you have these two FBI agents who come from outside and aren't part of either of that culture. Now, when you transpose that kind of situation to, say, Germany, you can't simply take a Southern German, like a Bavarian accent, and make that stand in for a Southern US, like a Mississippi accent, because that would be ridiculous. Anybody in Germany would know that this was happening in Mississippi and not in Bavaria. That's obvious. So the trick is to transpose the differences in social class, in origin, and education, and ways of expressing themselves, in the regionalisms, the dialect, in ways that are readable to a public in Germany or in France, but don't seem false.
Guten Morgen. Mein Name ist Alan Ward. Ich bin vom FBI.
Das Federal Bureau für Integration?
Yes, Larry. Jetzt meldet euch doch mal.
In der Aufmachung sind Sie nicht gerade inkognito, was?
Wir möchten zu Sheriff Stuckey.
Der Sheriff ist gerade schwer beschäftigt. Sie müssen warten oder anders mal wiederkommen.
Ich stehe an der Ecke Ashton. Keine besonderen Vorkommnisse.
Wir warten.
Alles ruhig.
Nicht, dass ich wüsste. Aber was nicht ist.
Ich fahr jetzt mal rüber zu Eddie. Er wollte was von mir. Melde mich wieder zurück.
Jetzt hör mir mal gut zu, du Kleinstadtarsch. Ich gebe dir 2 Sekunden, um den Sheriff herzuholen, oder ich trete die verdammte Tür ein, okay?
Na sowas. Sieht aus, als ob wir Besuch haben. 2 von den Hoover-Jungs bei uns im Süden. Wie geht's denn?
Gut.
Ich bin Sheriff Stuckey.
Rupert Anderson.
Rupert?
Aha.
Wir haben Sie schon erwartet. Wie ich sehe, haben Sie Hilfs-Sheriff Pell schon kennengelernt.
Allerdings.
Und Sie sind hier unten, um uns bei unserem Nigger-Problem zu helfen?
Nein, es geht hier um eine Vermisstenanzeige.
Sehen wir mal. Sagen Sie, muss hierbei unbedingt dabei sein?
Entschuldigung. Sheriff, ich bin Special Agent Ward und ich leite diesen Fall. Wir nehmen an, dass es sich hier nicht nur um eine Vermisstenanzeige handelt.
Sometimes that means a certain kind of cheating, because you can get across, for instance, a social class, or dub somebody who's a kind of 2-bit gangster, who maybe in an American movie would have a kind of rough New York accent, say. But when you're dubbing it into Italian, you can't choose another accent, but you can kind of get it through the quality of the voice, the quality of diction, how they pronounce or enunciate words, what the quality of the language is. But in a way, it's always a bit of a falsification, because a 2-bit gangster in Italy would speak with a local regional accent, which you can't use. In fact, one famous line about Italian as a language is that Italian is a language spoken only by dubbers. L'italiano è una lingua parlata soltanto dai doppiatori. And that is a reference to the fact that Italy is really a collection of different cultures, each region with its own dialect and language. And Italian as a common language is something that until late in the 20th century, most people didn't really use except in kind of official or educational or circumstances. But in their lives at home or in the street, that's not really the way they would speak. So dubbing was, and still is, done in a kind of common universal language that is quite distant from the language that people actually use at home. And that was particularly true in Italy. Another thing that I think Jeff faced and that I saw was really big differences in the way that a language sounds, and how you have to account for that in the interpretation. And I'll give you an example. A lot of American movies use a kind of unclear, rough pronunciation to get across a sort of casualness. And I remember particular when I was doing a movie called The Doors, which was about Jim Morrison and was set in the late 1960s, at a time when, America was completely, it was a time of the youth culture, the hippie culture, the drug culture, and Jim Morrison in particular was in the middle of that. And so the way they were talking was all kind of like this, as if they were stoned all the time, and you couldn't always understand what they were saying. And they didn't really project, they softened their voices. And I remember going to work on that in Spain. And in Spain, a dubbing actor will see a movie and see a movie loop and a script and will fall into habits of pronunciation that privilege comprehension. Because the dubbing public, the distributors, the dubbing directors wanted to make sure they weren't missing any words. So, Jim Morrison in that movie or a similar American character might say something like, "Hey man, what are you thinking? What's up? How did you come to think of that?" And a Spanish actor would look at that and say, "Hombre, ¿cómo te se ocurre de decirme eso? ¿Cómo te se ocurre hacer una cosa parecida?" The voice is pushed into the nasal cavity, it's projected, all of the syllables are clearly enunciated, and it just sounds completely different. And I remember saying to a dubbing director, like, don't you hear the difference? Like, can't you reproduce that kind of like youth culture of the 60s where everybody's kind of like hanging out stoned? And the guy looked at me and said, "In the late 60s, we had Franco. We did not have drugs. Nobody sounded that way. There were no hippies." And it was a real kind of illumination about how hard it is sometimes to take things that seem culturally you take for granted and transpose them to another country where there isn't a similar point of reference.
Es una canción cojonuda.
¿Sí?
Sí. ¿Tú escribiste eso? ¿Tienes otras aquí?
Sí, un montón, tío. Tengo todo un concierto en la cabeza, ¿sabes? Lo veo todo como
¿Qué te
una
ocurrió
escena.
en el desierto, tío?
El éxtasis.
Hagamos un grupo de rock y ganemos
Tengo
millones.
tanto, Ray. Toneladas, Ray.
Todo está a punto de estallar, Jim. Se nota en el aire. La gente quiere luchar o follar, amar o matar. Vietnam está ahí mismo. Ya se han escogido unos cuantos. Todo va a arder en llamas. El planeta está pidiendo el cambio, Morrison. Debemos crear los mitos.
Debería haber grandes orgías, tío. Como cuando Dionisos llegó a Grecia. Volvió locas a las mujeres que dejaban su hogar y se iban bailando a las montañas. Debería haber doradas cópulas en las calles de Los Ángeles.
Deberíamos llamarnos Dionisos.
Yo tengo un nombre. Dos.
There's another thing about Spain where there was a habit among dubbing actors to start out a line very strong and then kind of become breathy at the end. So the line that I said before, how could you think of doing such a thing, might sound in Spain in a dubbing studio, "Hombre, ¿cómo te se ocurre hacer eso?" And that becomes very difficult to deal with in the mix, because if you adjust the volume for the start of the line, then the end of it gets lost. And if you adjust for the end of the line so that that's comprehensible, the beginning starts to sound like you're shouting. And it sort of didn't matter whether two people were in bed together or standing on a noisy street corner, they would project it the same way. And so a lot of the work has to do with kind of matching the sound and the impulse and the speech mechanisms. And the language differences will work against you sometimes, not just habits, but just the way the language is constructed. The obvious thing is sync, where, especially in close-ups, the sync has to be very precise and not just lengths, but like if you have a labial, a B sound, in English, you have to have a B sound in Italian or French because anybody can see that that person is pronouncing a B. You see the lips explode. So if the line in English is, "That's what you believe," the literal translation of that in in Italian say is questo lo credi tu. There's no labial, there's no b sound at all in that line. So you have to change it, tweak the translation, and maybe use a different word in order to hit that sync. Okay, that's a technical question. But then there are things like, I remember in the late 80s doing a movie called The Believers. Not a very good movie about, Caribbean religion, and sort of it all got very creepy, and Martin Sheen plays a father who somehow gets involved in this or is investigating it. And there's a scene of a ritual in which a man is, I think, offering his own son for sacrifice. And the line in English is something like, "We consecrate this ground with a father's humble offering." I remember that, because a father's humble offering has this kind of punch to it. And you could say that in a crowded restaurant and somebody across the room would hear you, because it has a kind of cadence, and you hear that, father's humble offering. Well, translate that into French, it's "Nous consacrons ce seuil avec la humble offrande d'un père." And French has this kind of closed vowels instead of the open ones, and it all starts to sound like mush, everything kind of mushing together. La humble offrande d'un père.
Nous sanctifions ce sol par l'humble offrande de ce Père. Nous demandons à nos bienfaiteurs de nous accorder un peu de leur paix et de leur sagesse.
And I remember laughing about this with my father and saying, like, well, how do you even do that? How do you mix it so that sound pierces, and you feel that percussive quality of the invocation in this religious setting? It just sounds completely different. So I'm giving these as examples of the kind of thing I think my father became very expert in trying to negotiate. So there were, he was very focused on word choice and translations. He was focused on cultural references. He was focused on the sound of the language and on the implications of certain ways of talking, associations with things like educational level, or quirks, like how fast somebody was talking, how strange their diction might have been. Sometimes in the original, a character will have a very distinctive way of expressing himself. Maybe it's grammatically incorrect. Maybe it's some odd, weird word choices. And there's a risk that in translating that in the dubbing studio, that all becomes normalized and homogenized. And my father was very careful to try to preserve those things as well as he could, so that somebody who sounded weird in English would also sound weird in French. And I remember there was always this kind of struggle of trying to get that across, because he might come up with a solution and offer it to a dubbing director or a translator in the studio, and the dubbing director would say, like, no, we don't say that. Like, you can't say that. And my father would say, well, that's the point. Like, he speaks in a way other people don't. And they would be like, no, we just wouldn't say that. And so there was this kind of constant negotiation about how to make things just weird enough. My father was always an independent contractor. He worked as a freelancer on specific movies early on in his career. After 1987 or 88, he signed a contract with Columbia Pictures, which later became Sony, to do their movies exclusively, except for there was always a carve-out for one movie a year, which was almost always a Woody Allen movie. And he came to work on the Woody Allen movies because somebody had alerted Woody Allen to what they felt was a poor translation or a poor dub of, I think it was Zelig in the late 70s. And so he sent, first I think his editor, Sandy Morris, and then his personal assistant, Gail Cecilia, to Europe to oversee that and make sure that a Woody Allen movie got the treatment that it deserved. Gail Cecilia arrived in Europe, and she didn't speak the languages, and she didn't have the local understanding of the culture, and she was really pretty quickly out of her depth. But she met my father, and they talked about some of the issues, and she realized that that wasn't the work that she wanted to do and that she really wasn't comfortable doing. And so she arranged for my father to start taking over the work on Woody Allen movies. I think the first one might have been September. It was right around then. It was after Zelig, after Purple Rose of Cairo. I'm not sure exactly which the first movie was. But after that, he supervised the dub and subtitling of all of Woody Allen's movies through the rest of his life. So he had these two poles where he was working on those and on Columbia movies. And in the case of Columbia / Sony, his responsibilities became wider. He was really responsible for all of the versions, subtitled and dubbed, of all of the movies. But of course, when you're talking about dozens of movies, he couldn't devote the same amount of time to everyone. So he prioritized and really made sure he was present in the studio for the movies that really did require that kind of supervision. And that depended a little bit on who the director was, because from the point of view of the studio, part of my father's job was to keep the directors happy so that they would want to make another movie with that studio. And if the directors were concerned that their movie was being betrayed in translation, my dad's role was to step in, talk to the director, bring up a whole lot of issues that the directors themselves hadn't even thought of, explain how he was going to solve them, and at the end of an hour or 2 hour or 3 hour meeting, leave them feeling like they were in good hands, that they didn't need to personally solve all of the translation and adaptation problems for foreign. As a matter of fact, most directors were really pretty happy with that, because by the time the dubbing happened, the dubbed versions happened, they were usually on to the next project. They really weren't paying that much attention to that movie anymore. They had finished it, they'd wrapped it, it had been released. Now the dub was happening and they were on to something else. So when they came to trust him and they came to trust the idea that somebody of his caliber and understanding and sense of responsibility and work ethic was that detail-oriented and that obsessive as they were as creators, they felt reassured that the end product, even though they might not understand it, was going to be as good as it could be. And a lot of times, I know this was the case with Woody Allen, he didn't even want to see the dubbed version. It made him uncomfortable. It was like taking something you had made and like painting it all red or something. It came out to the creator themselves. It came out just too strange. And they didn't really they felt like there was no way it wasn't in some way going to be warped. But they could trust that for the audience in each of those countries, that experience would be as good as it could be. So Jeff had close relations with several, a succession of studio executives. Tony Manny was one for quite a long time. I know he had close dealings with Beverly Starr, who became Beverly G. In London, she was the head of distribution for Columbia for quite some time. And they would talk about a lot of the technical issues, but also the logistical ones. I mean, because a big part of the job was simply making sure that all of the materials got to the right place at the right time, casting, selecting the dubbing studio, organizing the schedule. It was a huge logistical operation, and that was a big part of his work. There were a few directors that he formed a relationship with early on, and I remember meeting as a young person. Robert Altman was one, Mike Nichols was another. Those were sort of work friendships that were centered on the movie themselves. They didn't really extend beyond that, but they built a kind of kinship. A lot of the rest of the time, his goal with a director was simply to make the director feel like they could walk away. So he would have these intense meetings, and he wanted to make sure the director liked him and trusted him. But ultimately, the goal was to keep the director from being too involved, because what he felt was that if the director, or this was also true of actors, became too involved in the details of dubbing, they could actually make bad decisions, not really understand what was going on, and undermine the quality of the dub. So he asked me to work with him because he couldn't be in every place at the same time. And so my being there made it possible for a while for him to feel like he had a representative in the studio. That wasn't easy for me. I was in my 20s. I was a young person, and I would come in with the authority, presumptive authority of the studio behind me. I was supposed to be the supervisor, although in fact I was much less experienced than almost everybody else in the studio, and visibly young. And so I had to struggle to be heard, to be respected. That meant being right about the interventions that I did make, and knowing when not to intervene. Later on, as a studying music and writing about music and writing music, I came to understand it as analogous to the role of an orchestral conductor, especially a young one who stands in front of an orchestra of people who are much older than he is. They play the trombone or the violin, and he doesn't. All he has, he's not making any sounds. He's just using a stick, and he has to project authority. He has to get the orchestra to respect him, and he has to know when not to say anything, when not to make a correction, let the orchestra work it out for themselves. It was a very similar kind of experience for me, and I learned something, I think, about how to manage that kind of situation in a group setting, to know when you're on solid ground and when you're not. And I was most on solid ground, and I think this was true for my father too, when I invoked something that the people in each country couldn't necessarily hear or didn't recognize. I don't know, for instance, I remember working on a film called Cadillac Man with Tim Robbins, in which he takes, I think it's a car dealership, hostage. He takes hostages in a car dealership, and at a certain point he tries to persuade all the hostages that he's really a good guy and that he's not a criminal, even though he's obviously doing something criminal. And if I'm remembering this correctly, he says at a certain point he releases several hostages, women, and the police have surrounded this car dealership, and he tells them to run out, to go and tell the police that he's really a stand-up guy. Now, a stand-up guy, if I'm remembering the phrase correctly, is a real Americanism. It's almost quaint. It's sort of like something maybe people in my great-grandfather's generation would have said. It's not really current slang. It just means somebody who's honest, somebody who's reliable, who's today we would say a mensch as a Yiddish word. Somebody who's not the kind of person who would take hostages in a car dealership. And so he says to them, tell them I'm a stand-up guy. And it's partially a comedic movie. And so there's this scene where the hostages come running out of the car dealership with their arms in the air, screaming at the police, "He's a stand-up guy! He's a stand-up guy! He's a stand-up guy!" And of course the police have no idea what's going on or like why these people are yelling. And it's quite a funny moment. And I remember discussing how you would translate that. I supervised the German version of that movie, and there was simply no obvious way of getting across the humor of that. And I remember laughing at the scene, and the German dubbing director, who actually spoke quite good English, couldn't understand what I was laughing at, because from his point of view, it was just some people coming out of a car dealership, a hostage, saying like, he's actually quite a decent person, which kind of makes all of the humor go away. And as I recall, the translation we used was, ist ein starker Typ, which literally means he's a strong man, but it was an expression that he felt kind of got across the same sensibility.
Also los, alle Bräute jetzt hier raus und sag den Bullen, dass ich ein starker Typ bin, klar? Du nicht! Setz dich! Setz dich!
Schon gut! Er ist ein starker Typ!
Again, I'm not entirely sure I'm getting the phrases exactly right. These are memories from 40 years ago. And they're my memories, but I think they're very similar to the things that my father dealt with every day of his life. He had an extensive collection of these kinds of anecdotes, translations that were, entirely wrong, that became funny, problems that needed to be solved. Sometimes they were large scale. I remember when he worked on the movie Annie in the 1980s, the distribution wanted to do something unusual, which was to redub all of the music, all of the songs into the local languages. And so he had to, there, not only do you have to get the meaning of the line and the sync, the lip sync and the lengths, but you also have to get it to scan, the lines to scan correctly, the right verse lengths, and to be musical, and to be something that a child's chorus could sing. And they re-recorded all of that in the dubbing studio. It was a huge enterprise to do, I forget how many songs, 12 songs in 4 languages, to write all of those songs, in ways that would make sense, and then get across the effervescence of the musical performance in each of those languages and match them up to the instrumental music that was already on the soundtrack.
Ça n'est pas le rêve pour nous. Ça n'est pas le rêve pour nous. Les petits câlins, c'est Tintin. Et les caresses pour nos fesses. Ça n'est pas le rêve. La vestire qua e là, struscia e striscia su e giù, lavorare finché vuoi, ma giocare no, non puoi, vita da knockout.
Fühlst du nicht, wie der Wind dir ins Gesicht weht? Sehnst du dich nicht nach Licht und frischer Luft? Jeden Tag stellst du fest, dass es so nicht geht.
Und eines Tages fällst du in die Gruft.
A la gente le importamos un pepino. Ni las ratas nos quieren consolar.
Nadie llena nuestro estómago vacío, aunque siempre estamos roncas de llorar.
My father, Jeff, was immensely respectful of the talent and the reputations of the people he worked with in each country. Many of them were very distinguished actors. Dubbing was only a part of their life. They were also theater actors and movie actors and did commercials, and this was part of their professional toolkit. So he didn't feel like he was coming in the expert telling everybody what to do. On the contrary, he felt like he was helping them do the best they already knew how to do, helping them to understand their jobs better, understand their roles better, and giving them the tools to deliver a really fine artistic performance, and not just kind of an industrial translation that would be done under very tight time constraints and budgetary constraints. And so he really never wanted to be be out front. He didn't want the credit in the movies. There's no movie that has him listed in the credits, even though it will have the dubbing studios in some cases and the foreign cast and the name of the translator. It never includes his name. It's why he didn't generally give interviews about what he did. And he had a sense of humor about himself. I remember that in Spain, he would sometimes go into these elaborate explanations of the kind that I've just been doing, of what the implication of a particular sentence or line in English might be. that wasn't coming across in the dub. And he would give you a whole history of, actually, this is a line that Babe Ruth said in 1927, and that was used in a TV show 20 years later, and he's invoking all of that. And the people in the Italian dubbing studio would look at him in complete mystification and just say, like, how do you expect us to get any of that across in one line of an Italian dub? And I remember there was a dubbing director by the name of Pino Colizzi who said, I know what we'll do. At this point, we're going to stop the projection in the movie theater, and we're going to lower Jeff from the ceiling by ropes like an angel, and he's going to come and he's going to explain this line to the audience. And when he's done, they will pull him back up, and the projection will continue. And it was a very funny moment, and my dad was very, able to laugh at himself about his sort of over-eagerness about trying to get something right that really couldn't be done, or just over-explain something. He enjoyed the irony of the fact that he was always sort of in the background, but his name, Jeff, Jeff, if you look at it in Spanish, looks like jefe, which was sometimes what they called him, ironically. It means chief. And so they would sort of say, el jefe dice, the chief says. But he really always tried not to be the last word, not to invoke not to be the boss, not to be the person who said it has to be this way, but always to try to get participation and buy-in from the people who were actually doing the work, for whose voices it was, who were going to understand best. And I think that part of all of that was that he understood the limits of his own cultural understanding. So he would try to drill down into the subtleties of an English original, but he knew that it wasn't that he didn't have the ability to figure out what that would be in each country, that he relied on people who could take that and say, the way we would say that is we would use this other expression. We wouldn't use that expression, we'd use a different one. And actually, one thing that comes to mind as an anecdote that wasn't my father's, but was Sandy Morse, Woody Allen's editor, who said that there was a joke in Zelig about that Woody Allen tells of his parents being children of the Depression, I think, and being so frugal that they would save bits of string. And when it came time to translate that into Spanish, the Spanish translator felt that didn't make any sense. Like, why would you save bits of string? It was not something that resonated. But I believe, and again, relying on my memory, that the equivalent was something about counting orange pips, orange seeds, which was not something that, my father or I or anybody from the United States would ever have thought of. But it's it was an expression that made some sense.
En el lecho de muerte, Morris Selig dice a su hijo que la vida es una pesadilla inútil, dándole un solo consejo: ahorra cortezas de naranja.
And sometimes those kinds of things were very subtle. For instance, I remember working on Dick Tracy, a movie with Warren Beatty, and he had this, watch, which looked very futuristic at the time. Now we would just think of it as an Apple Watch, but he was able to communicate with this wristwatch. And that was kind of, wow technology for the character in the 1940s, and even when the movie was made in the 1980s or early 90s. And so he would get a message, and Dick Tracy would speak into his watch, and his presence was needed at a crisis, and he would speak into his watch and say, "I'm on my way." And that became a line of Dick Tracy's. It goes back to the comic books. And so translating that in the movies seems very simple. It just means I'm coming. But there's a reason why the line is "I'm on my way" and not "I'm coming," or "I'll be there soon," or "be right there," or one of the many other options. It has a kind of ring to it. It has a kind of solemnity to it in English that had to be translated, and it sounds a little bit formal. My memory is that in Italian, the translation we chose was "sto arrivando," which literally means I am arriving. But it's an odd way of saying it. It's not necessarily the most obvious way of saying, I'm coming. You would say something like adesso vengo or arrivo subito, but you really wouldn't say sto arrivando, which means I'm literally arriving in this moment. But it gets across the formality and the immediacy of the original phrase.
Ehi Mike, ce l'hai un bel gelato?
Chiamata per Dick Tracy, chiamata per Dick Tracy.
Porta un gelato al ragazzino. Avanti, Sam.
Magazzini sud sul fiume, Tracy. Sta succedendo qualcosa. Dovresti farci una corsa.
Ok, sto arrivando.
But the point I was making about my father was that he would understand the subtlety of the line in English and the sort of comic book quality of it, but he couldn't necessarily judge whether in Italian he was getting the effect that he really wanted. And he relied on native Italian speakers or native French speakers or native German speakers or Spanish speakers to reassure him that that was the case. And I think that that's a very important part of his role, was to understand the limits of his authority, not just his formal authority in the dubbing studio, but also his own internal authority, like his own confidence that what was happening. And it was why I think he felt that it was important to keep dubbing directors a little bit away, because not dubbing directors, the original movie directors, because movie directors have made the movie. They're the auteurs. They command. They know exactly what they want. They tell everybody what they want. They're used to bossing people around. And if they thought that something was wrong, they would say so. And if they thought that they had an idea of what the right solution was, they would say, do it this way. And he felt like you always had to defer to people who didn't necessarily have the official status to make a decision, but who really did know better than him or than anybody else. So I hope I've gotten across a sense of what his role was like. I think his refusal or his disinterest in taking credit for what he did also jives with the way he thought about dubbing as an art form, and he did think of it as an art form. He was a creative person, but of course dubbing is not about creation, it's about interpretation. And he devoted his life to making sure that other people's creations sounded and looked right. But he did so understanding that the work at its best was invisible. If you noticed it, it meant that there was something wrong. The experience that he was being faithful to was for all of the technical aspects to go away, all of the decisions to simply vanish, and for the spectator to just be able to go to the movie and have an experience and buy into the illusion that these American actors are speaking Italian and you can understand what they say. And that's, I think, key to dubbing in those territories where it happens. Subtitling, you're getting the significance, but you know that you are missing those subtleties, because if you don't speak Norwegian or you don't speak Japanese, you're not really sure how a particular line sounds to people who do speak those things. With dubbing, you're creating the illusion that those subtleties are preserved and that Warren Beatty or Robert De Niro speaks German or Glenn Close speaks French, and that you as a French person or a German person are hearing a coherent original creation. So it was about that kind of last layer of interpretation and of technique that allowed people in those countries to experience those movies. And so he was most gratified, I think, when a dubbing was good enough to disappear. So again, I hope that gives you an idea of what he did for a living and what his role was, and I'm delighted that I had at least a few years of participation being able to see his work up close. Thanks very much. Goodbye.